Welcome to On the Middle East, the podcast of the award-winning media service Al Monitor, where each week we talk with the decision makers and thought leaders who are making the news and shaping the trends in the Middle East. I'm Andrew Parasolidi, president of Al Monitor, and today we are talking with Afshin Molavi. Afshin is senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies Foreign Policy Institute and founder of Emerging World newsletter. Afshin is one of the sharpest observers and analysts of trends in emerging markets, especially on themes related to China and the New Silk Road, South-South trade, global hub cities, new emerging market multinationals, global aviation, the geopolitics of energy, and the intersection of Middle East states and the global economy. As Afshin explains it, his writ is from Bollywood to bond markets. Afshin is a good friend and fellow SAIS graduate, a former World Economic Forum Young Global Leader, and a former distinguished journalist reporting from Riyadh, Tehran, and throughout the Middle East and Asia. He is also the author of an outstanding book, Persian Pilgrimages, which was reissued as The Soul of Iran, and that's about his travels and reporting in Iran. My conversation with Afshin Molavi begins now. Afshin, welcome to On the Middle East.
It's great to be with you, Andrew. Thank you.
Great to have you. Let's get into it. Afshin, you sometimes talk about the how am I supposed to make a living question in the Middle East. How am I supposed to make a living goes back to the origins of what we have since called the Arab Spring, which began in Tunisia back in 2010. I think answering that question of how to make a living just got a lot harder after COVID-19. What are the trends you are watching in the economies of the region?
Thanks, Andrew. I'm glad you brought that question up to begin with, because originally, how do we make a living, or how am I supposed to make a living, was the question that Mohammed Bouazizi asked as he was rudely pushed out of the municipality building in Sidi Bouzid, Tunisia. Now, Mohammed Bouazizi, as many of your listeners will know, was the Tunisian fruit and vegetable vendor who on December 17th, 2010, was confronted by a police officer and told he doesn't have the right permit to operate his fruit and vegetable stand. And Mohammed Bouazizi was operating in what economists call the informal economy, right? So he was providing for 4 brothers and sisters and his mother and father from that fruit and vegetable stand. And so when he went to the municipality to get his permit back, he had, as the saying goes, neither bakshish, which is a bribe, nor wasta, which is connections, and he was pushed out. And when he got pushed out, he didn't say, give me liberty or give me death. He said, how am I supposed to make a living? And that's a question that was salient then and is still salient today. When you look at youth unemployment in Tunisia and Egypt and some of the countries that were hit hardest by the Arab uprisings, it seems like, we're actually at we're seeing worse numbers today than we were back then. Broadly speaking, youth unemployment was close to around 30% at the time of the Arab uprisings. Today, they're roughly the same. Tunisia actually has higher youth unemployment numbers today. Egypt has higher youth unemployment numbers today. So that question, how am I supposed to make a living? Look, Mohammed Bouazizi was living, as I said, in the informal economy. He wasn't living in the Davos economy, right? So, I remember before the uprisings, there was a lot of talk about Egypt and Egypt's economic rise. And there was some truth to that. There was a lot of foreign direct investment flowing into Egypt. The markets were looking good in Egypt at the time. But I remember there was an Egyptian blogger at the time who said, I wish I lived in macro world, because everybody tells me the macro numbers look good. So there's plenty of people who don't live in macro world, who are not benefiting from some of that growth and some of the growing middle classes that was taking place at the time, and we're asking themselves, how am I supposed to make a living? And then now we have the COVID-19 pandemic, right? So COVID-19 pandemic hit all across the world, not just the Middle East, North Africa region, but it hit particularly the Mohammed Bouazizis of the world, the people who don't have Zoomable job, so to speak. I mean,
Right.
the great dividing line now, Andrew, I think, is between those who have Zoomable jobs and those who don't. Well, obviously, the Bouazizis of the world did not have Zoomable jobs, and they've got hit much harder. The World Bank has noted that we could see another 100 million people fall into extreme poverty in the year 2020. And by the way, that's the first time in 20 years that poverty numbers have gotten worse, according to World Bank numbers. And so the how am I supposed to make a living question remains, unfortunately, still very salient today.
Have you noticed as well that prior to COVID, there seemed to have been a trend, again, starting late December 2018, and I pinpointed in Sudan, and then it picked up in 2019 in Algeria, Lebanon, Iraq, and elsewhere, where you had a similar, almost a sequel to what happened in the 2010, 2011 era, where there was indeed some changes. I mean, Bashir was overthrown, deposed in Sudan. You had a change in Algeria because of the reaction, the violent reaction to the demonstrations in Iraq. Prime Minister Abdul Mahdi was replaced eventually by Mustafa al-Kadhimi, who has initiated a reform program. And that trend seems to have been interrupted, though not entirely, by COVID. Have you noticed that trend as well? And do you think that's a fair characterization of what's happening in the region?
I think you're right, Andrew, and I was noticing it as well, and you put it better than I would, as kind of a something of a sequel to the Arab uprisings, because all across those countries you mentioned and the regions you mentioned, there was an underlying theme to a lot of these protests, and the underlying themes revolved around frustrations about lack of jobs, frustrations around corruption. Frustrations around general governance issues. I mean, electricity shortages, infrastructure bottlenecks, the price of various goods, and one of the things that you notice, and you've noticed this, Andrew, in your travels, I'm sure, all across the Middle East and North Africa region. When you travel across the region, you notice that the aspirations of people that you meet are universal, and they're not grand. The aspirations are for a decent job, decent healthcare, educational opportunities for their children, a government that does not steal from the people, a government that is not corrupt. And so all across the region, you're seeing people reacting against that. And it was really in so many ways the fuel that drove many of these protests.
Let's talk about the UAE and in particular Dubai. You have spent a lot of time there, and as much or more than any other analyst have chronicled its rise as an international hub, illustrative of both urbanization and globalization trends. What I find interesting about Dubai, I don't know if you share this as well, is it's one of the few cities in the world, maybe up there with New York and London. There may be some in Asia where I don't travel as much, where you could see just about anyone at any time. And I would find myself when I'm going to Dubai, kind of saying to many people, some in the UAE and some not, saying, hey, I'm going to be in Dubai. Are you going to be there? And you get a lot of yeses. And you see a lot of people. It is truly not just a regional hub, an international hub.
I think you're absolutely right. I remember speaking with a Nigerian businessman in Dubai, and he does business in India, and he has a partner in India that they conduct business with. And I asked him, how often do you go to India? And he said, well, I don't really need to go to India much, because whenever I need to see my partner, I just say, meet me in Dubai.
Right.
And this meet me in Dubai has become kind of so much a part of the emerging markets world. You mentioned that it's a part of your world. It's certainly part of my world as well. I often find I'll send an email out to some friends saying I'm headed to Dubai, and you're right. Chances are you'll see people who are passing through. But it's, I've been looking at Dubai, for more than a quarter of a century. And the reason is I went there at a very young age, the early part of my career. And I early on, I saw this as a cosmopolitan, nexus city. And I like cosmopolitan nexus cities like Hong Kong and Singapore and Miami that are at the kind of hubs of trade and people and aviation and tourism. And early on, I saw it. But I like to joke that I knew Dubai before it became Dubai, right? It became this big international city that everybody knows about. And I think what happens is it's the glitz of Dubai that has turned some people away from taking it seriously as a place to study and as a place to look at. And I think that's a shame, because you really, once you peel back beyond the Kim Kardashian glitz and the 7-star hotels, you see a really important story in the emerging markets and a really important story in our world. So I often say Dubai has been at the kind of epicenter of 3 big revolutions. The aviation revolution is the first one. We take it for granted, but before COVID, we took it for granted, air flights. But in the year 2019, 4.6 billion passengers took to the air, right? So this is unprecedented numbers, but it's also, when you think about it, what we were beginning to see was air travel just becoming a normal part of human existence in the Asian middle classes, right? Whereas 25 years ago, it would have been not entirely uncommon for a member of the Indian middle class to never get on an airplane. Now it's entirely uncommon. For them to have not got on an airplane. So there's a lot more Indians flying. And Dubai has been at the epicenter of this aviation revolution. In 2014, Dubai International surpassed London Heathrow as the busiest international air hub in the world, and it's not going to look back. I mentioned India because when I was looking at UAE air hub statistics, I came across an extraordinary one. 1 out of 3 international flights that leave India land in the UAE, and 1 out of 3 international flights that land in India emanate from the UAE. So the UAE, but particularly Dubai, has become India's air gateway to the world. So that's the first one. And then, the second revolution that they've been a part of is, in many ways, is the trade revolution, right? So UAE, as something like 0.1% of the world's population, but they account for about 1.5% of world trade. Now, and that's not because of their oil trade, it's because of Dubai and its role as a global trade hub. The Jebel Ali port is the 9th busiest container terminal hub in the world. And when you go there, it's kind of like being in Hong Kong's port or Singapore's port. It's just this dizzying scene of globalization where you see containers as far as the eye can see. And the UAE accounts for about 2.5% of world sea container trade. For a small country, you've heard this term "little Sparta," Andrew, where the UAE is often considered little Sparta, a small country that punches above its weight militarily. But I think the UAE punches above its weight geoeconomically, and in many ways that's a more interesting story. And then the third one is the UAE and Dubai as part of the emerging markets revolution. 85% of the world lives outside of the West. 85% of the world lives in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. And in so many ways, I'm glad you brought up that point in the very beginning about you meeting people in Dubai. Dubai has become almost the hotel lobby for the emerging world. Yeah. Everybody goes through there, or flows through there, or trades there, or does some business there, or does some tourism there. So I think when you take Dubai seriously as a nexus city, as a hub city, as a very important piece of our global economy, you'll find a lot of interesting connections there.
Do you see post-COVID that Dubai can reclaim that status, because aviation trade has been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, absolutely. I think on the trade front, I think they'll recover quicker because the trade has been impacted less by COVID. We've still seen a whole lot of trade, just different things, personal protective equipment, and a lot of people in the West are buying new computers and televisions and that sort of things and gearing up their homes. And by the way, one of the most interesting aspects of the Jebel Ali port is the number of containers that are coming from China that flow through there. There was a statistic that noted that 60% of China's flows to Europe, Africa, and the Middle East flow through Dubai. So I think that the container shipping and the trade piece will recover sooner. The aviation piece and the tourism piece are certainly, as goes globalization, as goes aviation, so goes Dubai's recovery. So I think it's going to take longer. But if we look at the projections of the IATA, the International Air Transport Association, and others that are looking to 2022, late 2020, 2023, a return to 2019 levels of travel, well, then it would make sense that we'll see Dubai return as the leading international air hub and Dubai return as a major tourism hub. But make no mistake, it's been painful for them as it has been for all tourism and aviation hubs.
We have a major crisis right now with the blocking of the Suez Canal, although as of this morning, it seems like there might be some movement and progress there in getting that ship out of the way. Traffic through the canal has rarely been hindered in the past. I, off the top of my head, can't recall any other major incidents of this scope. And that on Monitor, we track the kind of cross-regional, and here I say Africa and the Middle East, and international centrality of the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea and the Suez Canal, as well as the Nile Dam, from both an economic and security perspective. What's your takeaway from what's happening at the Suez now, and what do you think it means for Egypt and that part of the world? And would you share the view that the Red Sea, the canal, and all this activity around that area is also a critical international hub?
Absolutely. And you were speaking my language, Andrew, when you said cross-regional, trans-regional. I think we sometimes do get caught up in the classifications, the legacy classifications. So the term Middle East, I mean, you know this, but the Middle East is a term that was invented by an American naval strategist writing in a British policy journal in the year 1902. He was looking for a way to describe this landmass between the Far East and Europe, and he called it the Middle East, if I may call it such. And the name stuck, right? And then it's been expanded to the Middle East, North Africa. So we say the MENA region, right? But you know who doesn't bother with classifications like that? Traders and business people and others, and and because they see that from Dubai to Mumbai, it's a 2-hour flight. From Dubai to Beirut, it's a 4-hour flight. If you are a North African state, you are much more geo-commercially European than you are Middle Eastern, right? And so I bring that up just to say that the Middle East and North Africa region, if we're going to use that term, is very much a part of the global economy because it is so much linked to Africa, to Europe, and to Asia in so many ways. And so the Suez Canal crisis is one example of that. But I think if you were to take the Suez Canal, and if you were to take the Strait of Hormuz, and you would take the Bab al-Mandeb, bordering Djibouti and Yemen, the entryway to the Red Sea. I mean, these are 3 of the 4 most important oil choke points in the world. The Suez Canal is one of the more important trade throughways of the world. Something like 12 or 13% of the world's trade passes through there. And then, so I think we have to think about the Middle East and North Africa region as part of this larger global economy. And the best way to think about that is to think trans-regionally. And let me give you an anecdote on that. Again, it was based in Dubai. I met someone who was working for an Indian food conglomerate, and he was telling me, about his business. And I said, well, you're based in Dubai, so what part of the world do you cover from here? And he said, well, I cover Central Asia, the Caucasus, Eastern Europe, and South Asia. He didn't say a thing about the Middle East and North Africa region. And he said, because, I have good air connections to all those places, and there's good trade connections to all those places. And I can use the air connectivity and the shipping connectivity. And so I think, we have to start thinking more like traders and less like land-based geopolitical analysts. And so I'm glad you brought that up. And I, by the way, I do notice that in your coverage at Al Monitor, and I commend you on it, Andrew.
Well, thank you. We've got a great team, and one of the advantages of Al Monitor is we rely on people in the region to tell us what's happening there. Let me focus a little more on Egypt. You had mentioned it earlier, and the Arab Spring started in Tunisia. Then, of course, Mubarak is deposed. You had Morsi, and you had a period of instability. And the Egyptian economy, which you mentioned in the macro sense prior to the Arab Spring, looked like there was some progress, then hit another rough patch. But under Sisi, it seems like, and again, according to the macro indicators, there's been some progress. In fact, if you look at the IMF numbers over the last year, June to June, there's 2.8% growth during COVID. I think the only country in the region that's showing positive economic growth and a rare positive growth for any country in the world during COVID. How do you see Egypt's trajectory in terms of these trans-regional trends, international trends, and its role in the region and its economic situation post-COVID?
I'm glad you brought that up because when you think about Egypt, it fits well with the Suez Canal story because in many ways some of the roughly the four pillars of the Egyptian economy tend to be Suez Canal, which is one of them, remittances, tourism, and oil and gas, right? And as you know, it's not a major oil and gas producer, but it could become a much more significant one. And Suez Canal receipts have been strong even through COVID. So I think that has been helping Egypt. Remittances have taken a hit, and obviously tourism has taken a hit. But Egypt didn't have the kind of heavier lockdowns that some of the other countries had, and that's why I think they managed to grow. I think that the key question for Egypt is always going to be how do you get how do you manage to get the macro numbers to trickle down to a broader segment of the population. As I said, on the eve of the Arab uprisings in 2010, Egypt was the darling of the emerging markets set. I remember I was in Davos one year, and Egypt hosted the last party at Davos that night, and Amr Diab, the great Egyptian pop singer, sang at that event, and it was probably one of the coolest things I've seen because there were maybe 50 people on the dance floor. I think not many people knew who Amr Diab was, but I was a huge Amr Diab fan. So my wife and I were dancing the night away to Amr Diab. But I remember there was such exuberance over Egypt that year in Davos that it's turning a corner and it's going in the right direction. And the stock market was up. And I think, the danger is that we could see something like that again when the numbers are growing and there's more interest in Egyptian stocks, and it's not trickling down to a broader segment of the population, and therein lies the danger. And let me just also add that on Egypt, it also has this extraordinary potential to be this bridge between Africa, Mediterranean Africa and Europe. It has sub-Saharan Africa and Europe, and the broader quote unquote Middle East and Africa. It has this extraordinary potential to be that bridge, but I don't think it has fulfilled that potential.
I can't envision from a straight regional security perspective an issue that Egypt doesn't play a significant role in, whether it's Libya, whether it's Israeli-Palestinian issues, whether it's counterterrorism. And you just laid out, its centrality in terms of the trans-regional economic and international issues.
And then the other interesting piece about Egypt is China's role. China's role as an investor in the Suez Canal economic zone, China's role as an investor in Egypt in general. When you look at China's flows to the Middle East and North Africa region writ large, the big numbers tend to be in places that are major oil and gas producers. So Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Iran, Algeria. But another place that has attracted a significant amount of China's interest and investment has been Egypt. It's one of the few that is not, the only one that's not a major oil and gas producer that I dub as part of the $20 billion plus club. And that's the club of countries that have received more than $20 billion of projects and or foreign direct investment. I think that we have to distinguish between when China actually does FDI or when China does a construction project in a place. And so China does see that value in Egypt beyond its role as in other places like Saudi Arabia, for example, or Iraq. There's a lot of opportunities to just do a lot of construction projects. In Iraq's case, there's a lot of opportunity to get involved in the oil business. But for Belt and Road planners, they see exactly what you and I just talked about. Egypt is a very important trans-regional hub for so many of the important regions across the Belt and Road.
Afshin, you wrote an outstanding report on China's role in the region last year for the Hoover Institution. If I have this right, you expected the trade and commercial relationships to deepen. We're seeing that happening, but that China's limited security role will limit its influence. Now, in the past few days, just this past week, Iran and China have signed a 25-year cooperation agreement. The UAE and China have decided to embark on a partnership for vaccine production. And China has even offered a 5-point plan for the Arab-Palestinian-Israeli issue. Now, I'm not sure if that's going to go anywhere, but there it is. How do you see this trend in the region? And do you believe that post-COVID, we might see China take an increasingly political or security role in the Middle East?
That's the ultimate question, Andrew, isn't it? Because clearly China's a prominent geoeconomic actor in the region, and in many ways, the most important geoeconomic actor in the region. It's the most important, the top trade partner of a dozen countries across the region. It is the number 1 or 2 or 3 export destination of more than a dozen countries across the region, particularly the oil and gas producers. And so it is increasingly a very important geoeconomic actor in the region. So the numbers will just show you that. Now, when it comes to security relations, thus far, the bargain has held, particularly if you look at the Gulf Cooperation Council countries. The bargain has held that we will sell a lot of oil and gas to China. We will engage in strategic relationships in oil and gas with China, in co-investment in refineries and the like. And we will continue to welcome China's investment and or participation in construction projects in our world. But at the end of the day, the United States is still the security underwriter of the region. And that has suited China just fine. After all, the oil flows, the co-investment in projects and refineries show that China is taking a more strategic economic outlook on the region. But why get involved in policing Persian Gulf sea lanes, for example, right? When you don't have to. So that has worked, well for China thus far. The question is, and I mentioned in my paper, this is China MENA. We're in China MENA 2.0. China MENA 1.0 was the traditional hydrocarbons exports to China, manufactured goods flowing back from China to the Middle East and North Africa region. China MENA 2.0 is hydrocarbons exports to China, manufactured goods coming from China to the region, but also much deeper and denser investment ties and trade ties. Going back to year 2006 when Industrial and Commercial Bank of China initialed its first IPO. The two of the biggest investors were the Kuwait Investment Authority and the Qatar Investment Authority. And in 2010, when the Agricultural Bank of China issued its IPO, two of the biggest investors were those same sovereign wealth funds. And by the way, Andrew, I think Mao Zedong was probably spinning in his grave, seeing Agricultural Bank of China, his bank for peasants, which was set up for IPO by Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs, and the biggest investors in it were sovereign wealth funds from the Gulf, which in the Mao era they viewed these countries as part of the American imperial project. Not necessarily countries that they much preferred aligning themselves with the non-aligned countries like Iraq and Algeria and Syria and Egypt at the time. Anyway, so when do we go to MENA China 3.0, i.e. security cooperation? We're not there yet. It doesn't mean that we'll never get there yet, but the bargain that obtains right now is one that I think we'll be living with for the next decade. And then let me just touch on the China-Iran question that you brought up. Andrew, I've been following Iran matters for a long time, and one of the things I've learned, particularly when it comes to China-Iran relations, is don't follow the MOUs, follow the money. And when you follow the money rather than the MOUs, the memorandums of understanding, you see that China does not take Iran as seriously as it takes maybe a Pakistan. China doesn't think twice about pouring $50 billion into Pakistan, but it drags its feet on a lot of its investments in Iran. When you look at the numbers between China and the UAE and China and Saudi Arabia and the depth of the relationships, it doesn't compare to China's relationship with Iran. Buying Iranian oil, sometimes people get excited because they say China just bought a lot of Iranian oil this past month. Well, in the world of oil, that's kind of like dating, buying someone's oil. It's much more of a serious relationship when you co-invest in refineries, right? And that's what China does with Saudi Arabia, and it's what is done with Kuwait and others. And so I'll believe that this China-Iran relationship is getting deeper when I see it. And one of the reasons why the China-Iran relationship is not getting deeper is not that China doesn't want to make this relationship deeper, because China fears U.S. sanctions. They won't admit it publicly, but when you sent $400 billion worth of goods to the United States last year, you don't want to lose that market. And this was $400 billion worth of goods, despite all the talk of tensions and tariffs, et cetera, et cetera. You don't want to lose that market. Iran has the GDP roughly the size of the state of Ohio, right? So are you going to lose the market of the United States for Iran if you know that you could be sanctioned much further for some of the things that you're doing? So it's I'll believe the China-Iran strategic relationship story on the economy when I begin to see the numbers, and I haven't seen the numbers. And there's the last thing I want to say on this is, if you want to talk to someone who's frustrated with China, talk to someone from the National Iranian Oil Company. They're very frustrated with China because they often say that China is very quick to sign memorandums of understanding, but they don't follow through. Iran's National Iranian Oil Company has booted a China company out of 2 major gas projects for foot dragging just in the past decade. So again, I think there's less to that story than meets the eye.
Is the China model gaining in the traction to the region relative to the United States following the COVID-19 pandemic? Or is the United States still in a pretty good place?
It's a good question, Andrew. And I think, in many ways, across the region among, elites, if you could tell them that we're going to give you a model in which you can, give your people economic growth and grow your middle class, but we're still going to you're still going to control the commanding heights, so to speak, of politics. And then I think there are many political elites in the region that would take that. I'm not so sure it has popular appeal on a popular level, the quote unquote China model, but on a political elite level, I think there is some appeal. Economic growth, you become a major force in the global economy, you grow your middle class, but you still control the commanding heights of the of politics. But on a popular level, I think that's not the case. I think one of the great services over the past, decade or so has been this Arab Youth Survey that has come out. And I know you've written about it in the past, Andrew, as well. This survey of young Arabs between the age of 18 to 24, asking them a whole series of questions about, how they would like to live their lives. And it's a very hopeful document when you read it, because when you read the aspirations of young Arabs between the age of 18 to 24, you see their aspirations are universal, and they want decent jobs, they want better education, they want more women's rights, want more human rights, they want better governance at the top, and one of the questions they often ask young Arabs is, if you could live anywhere in the world, where would you live? And that's a revealing question. And number one has usually been the UAE among young Arabs, and number two has been the United States and others. And I think that's a very revealing question.
Afshin, we are just about out of time, and I want you to talk about your latest venture, Emerging World, and your Emerging Markets Daily newsletter. And let me just say, we all get a lot of incoming newsletters and email, but the Emerging Markets Daily newsletter is a must open and a must read. I really enjoy it. I always learn from it. Tell us about eWorld and emerging markets, and about your latest article where you take us back to the origins of the term emerging markets.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And if I, a shameless plug, you just have to go to eworld.substack.com, or just go to Substack and look up Emerging World. And this Emerging Markets Daily that you referred to, I'm glad that you're finding it useful. Thank you. I think so many of us who cover the Middle East have found Al Monitor so useful for so many years. So thank you and all your colleagues for what you do. Let me just tell you kind of the origin of this. When I began my career, in many ways, my very first job out of college was working for an English language newspaper in Saudi Arabia. It's a whole long circuitous story, and maybe we'll save that for another podcast about how I ended up in Saudi Arabia. But one of the things I found when I was covering business in Saudi Arabia was my days kind of looked like this. If it was Tuesday, it was a South Korean trade delegation. If it was Wednesday, it was a Pakistani banker's reception. If it was Thursday, it was maybe a group of Nigerian traders. And in many ways, I was just seeing the world come to Saudi Arabia, a place that I didn't think was so globalized, but it really was in terms of its business environment. And this is the early to mid 1990s, and I kind of pinned that in my mind. And as I traveled to the region over and over, I was based in Dubai with the Reuters news agency. I went to Iran, where I was working as a freelancer for the Washington Post and others. Then I began traveling across Asia. And everywhere I went, I was seeing this interconnectivity of the Middle East and Asia and Africa in so many ways. And so I began writing about this theme. And so the emerging world is, 25 plus years of looking at this theme. And I'm finally saying, you know what, I should start regularly posting on this. And put together an emerging markets daily of sorts. And my most recent column, I went to the source of the term emerging markets. A couple of years ago, I was chatting with Antoine van Achtemel. He is a Dutch economist who is one of the great emerging markets investors. But back in 1981, he was an official with the International Finance Corporation of the World Bank Group. And he was pitching a diversified equity fund that would invest in the quote unquote third world, right? And in fact, the name of the fund was Third World Equity Fund. And the way he told me the story was that, someone stood up at the event that he spoke at Salomon Brothers in 1981 and said, young man, great idea, horrible name. And so he went back that weekend and he kept thinking about a new name for his fund. And he came up with this term emerging markets. And the way he described it, on Monday, he showed it to his boss, and his boss, okayed it. And within 30 seconds, this new term had emerged. And in so many ways, that new term was more appropriate, but it also unlocked the thinking of so many people saying, no, maybe these are not just third world. Third world had become, as you know, this slur. It wasn't something that was looked upon well, even though the origin of the term third world, which I also look at in the column, was a French historian who was writing in terms of Cold War terms, as the third world being the countries that were non-aligned with either the Soviet camp, which is the second world, or the US camp, which is the first world. So I started getting into the origin of names, but the emerging markets, that moment in 1981, I think was a really interesting moment that led to what we've seen over the past 40 plus years of this extraordinary transformation. And then just lastly, I'll say that I think these are some of the biggest trends that we should all be looking at. The rapid urbanization that we've seen across the world, the unprecedented connectivity that we've seen across the world, and growing middle classes. And in many ways, these are disruption-proof trends. They are so deep and so entrenched that they are disruption-proof. And I think even this theme of growing middle classes is gonna be slowed by the COVID-19 pandemic, but it's not going to be halted. And so sometimes it's useful in a world where we all have geopolitical whiplash to latch onto some trends that are disruption-proof, like demographics and urbanization and connectivity.
Afshin, thank you. It's been a great conversation. It's really been a pleasure having you today on the Middle East. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you very much. It's been my great pleasure.
We will return after this break.
I'm Ben Caspit, Al Monitor veteran columnist reporting from Israel, one of the world's major news and action suppliers of all times, comparing to its tiny size. I've been covering and analyzing the political, diplomatic, and military arenas in Israel for over 34 years. My best-selling biography, The Netanyahu Years, was out 2 years ago. I covered 7 prime ministers, 1 major war, 2 intifadas, 1 prime minister's assassination, 2.5 peace treaties, 4 military operations in Gaza, and it's not letting up anytime soon. I'm glad to invite you to On Israel, our brand new podcast, where we will discuss major events in Israel and its surroundings, talk to decision makers, leaders, and analysts, and try to understand the chaos that comes with the territory of Israel and the Middle East. You will never have a dull moment with us. See you soon here on Israel, Al Monitor.
That was a fantastic conversation just now with Afshin Molavi about trends in the Middle East and emerging markets. I especially liked his reference to Egyptians living in the macro world and the continuing challenge of how the benefits of globalization and development can eventually reach those whom it has passed by until now. And it seems to me that the making a living question, which Afshin talked about in detail, is going to be that much harder following the COVID-19 pandemic. Thanks to our production team of Phil Calabro of El Monitor and Beowulf Roshland of Two Square Media Productions, and to all of you for listening today. We will return next week, and in the meantime, please sign up for this and our other El Monitor podcast on Israel at your favorite podcast platform.